I don't know what made me say yes to the trip. Maybe I wanted a break from the city. Maybe I was trying to prove something to myself. Either way, I agreed when my brother, Eric, invited me to a remote cabin for the weekend. Just the two of us, like when we were kids. The place was deep in the woods, a good 3-hour drive from the nearest town. The last stretch was nothing but a narrow dirt road with no signs, no streetlights, just trees pressing in on both sides. It was the kind of place where you'd lose service long before you arrived. I didn't like that. Eric was always the adventurous one. He'd gone camping alone in places I wouldn't even drive past at night. I preferred 4 walls and a locked door, but I told myself I needed this. Get away from work, breathe fresh air, spend time with my brother. So I went. The cabin was old but solid. 1 story, no basement, a fireplace in the living room. No electricity except for a small generator, and even that Eric said we should use sparingly. Water came from a well pump outside. It wasn't much, but it was enough. The first night was fine. We made a fire, drank some beers, talked about dumb things we remembered from when we were kids. It had been a long time since we'd done that. I almost felt good about being there. Then I woke up in the middle of the night. It was dead silent. Not just quiet silent. No wind, no insects, no night sounds at all. The kind of silence that feels wrong. I sat up in my sleeping bag, listening. The fire had burned down to embers, casting just enough light to see the outline of the room. Eric was still asleep. Everything looked normal, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I got up, careful not to make noise, and stepped to the window. It was pitch black outside. No moon, no stars, just endless dark pressing against the glass. I thought about going back to sleep, but then I saw something move. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, a shadow shifting in the trees. But as my eyes adjusted, I saw it wasn't just one thing. There were several figures, standing far enough away that I couldn't make out details, but close enough that I knew they were watching. I felt my pulse hammering in my ears. I wanted to wake Eric, but some instinct told me not to move. Not yet. Then they started walking. Slow, deliberate. Not towards the cabin, not at first. Just moving through the trees, circling, testing. They didn't make a sound. No crunch of leaves, no snap of twigs. Just that awful silence, and the feeling that something was deeply, terribly wrong. I backed away from the window, barely breathing. My mind raced through explanations, hunters, hikers, maybe some backwoods locals messing with us. But nothing felt right. I crouched next to Eric and shook his shoulder. He woke with a start, but before I could say anything, we heard it. A single, sharp knock at the door. Neither of us moved. We just stared at each other in the dim firelight, listening. Another knock, then another. Slow, steady, deliberate. Eric reached for the hunting rifle he'd brought. I grabbed the flashlight. He motioned for me to turn it off. I did. Then the doorknob started to turn. Eric was on his feet in an instant, leveling the rifle at the door. My heart was pounding so hard I thought I might pass out. The knob rattled again, harder this time. Then it stopped. Silence. We stood there, waiting. Then we heard footsteps, moving away from the door. Slow, dragging steps like whoever it was wanted us to hear them leaving. We didn't move for what felt like hours. When dawn finally came, we opened the door. There were no footprints, no signs that anyone had been there. We packed up and left that morning. I never asked Eric if he saw them too. I didn't want to know, and I'll never go back to that cabin again. The drive up to the cabin was rough. The road was mostly dirt and full of potholes, and my old truck rattled with every bump. The last town had been an hour back, just a handful of buildings at a lonely intersection, and I hadn't seen another car since. I was going up to the mountains to get away for a while, clear my head. No phone, no distractions, just the woods, the silence, and me. The cabin itself was nothing special, just a small, weathered structure with a sagging porch and a tin roof that looked like it had been patched a few times. I stepped out of my truck, stretched my legs, and took in the surroundings. Tall pines towered overhead, their branches shifting with the wind. The air smelled like damp earth and rotting leaves. The forest was quiet, too quiet. No birds, no distant rustling of small animals. Just the wind pushing through the trees. Inside, the place was basic. A single room with a bed, a wood stove, and a small kitchen area. There was a door in the back leading to what I assumed was the bathroom, but other than that, it was just me and the walls. There was no electricity, no running water. I had brought enough food and bottled water to last a few days. I set my bag down, took a deep breath, and tried to relax. The first night was fine, cold but manageable. I had the wood stove burning, a thick blanket wrapped around me. The only sounds were the occasional creak of the cabin settling and the wind outside. At some point, I drifted off to sleep. I woke up suddenly, heart hammering. I wasn't sure why at first. The fire was still glowing in the stove, faint but alive. My breath was visible in the air. Then I realized the silence had changed. There was a sound now, something faint outside, a rhythmic tapping, light and deliberate, coming from the porch. I sat up, listening. It stopped. Just the wind again. I exhaled, shook my head. Probably a branch knocking against the railing. I forced myself to lie back down, but sleep didn't come easy after that. The next morning, I checked the porch. No branches close enough to tap against anything. The railing was solid, no loose boards. I told myself it didn't matter. Probably a bird or some other small animal. I pushed the thought away and focused on chopping wood, gathering water from the nearby stream, making sure I had enough supplies in case the weather turned bad. That night, it happened again. The same tapping, same pattern. Slow, deliberate. I sat up in bed, eyes locked on the front door. I waited, breath shallow. After a minute, it stopped again. This time, I stood up, moved to the window and peered out. Nothing. Just the dark trees, shadows shifting in the moonlight. I told myself I was imagining things, that my mind was playing tricks on me in the isolation. But something felt off. The air inside the cabin felt heavier, like the walls were pressing in. I forced myself to lie back down, but I didn't sleep much. By the third night, I was on edge. I kept the hatchet I had been using for wood next to my bed, just in case. I sat up late, listening, waiting. The wind howled outside, stronger than before. The fire crackled in the stove. Then, just past midnight, the tapping came again. This time, it was different, closer, more insistent. I gripped the hatchet, moved slowly toward the door. My hands were clammy, my heart pounding. I reached for the handle, hesitated. Every instinct told me not to open it. Instead, I pressed my ear against the wood. The sound stopped immediately. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The morning brought a thick fog, curling through the trees, making everything feel even more isolated. I stepped onto the porch and froze. There, in the dirt just beyond the steps, were footprints.
Bare footprints.
Human. I stared, my stomach twisting. The prints were fresh, leading from the tree line to the porch and then back again. Someone had been out here watching, listening. My mind raced. Who would be this deep in the woods, barefoot in the freezing cold? I packed my things. I didn't care that I had planned to stay another few days. I didn't care that I had driven hours to get here. I threw everything into the truck and didn't look back. As I drove away, something in the rearview mirror caught my eye. A figure standing at the edge of the trees. Not moving, just watching. I didn't slow down, didn't stop. Just kept driving until I was back on paved roads, until I saw the first sign of civilization. I never went back. never wanted to buy a cabin. I wasn't one of those people who dreamed of escaping the city, of unplugging, of chopping wood and living off the land. But my brother, Nate, had a different idea. He had been on this whole survivalist kick for years, always talking about being self-sufficient, about how one day we'd need a place to go when things got bad. I thought it was just talk, but then he bought the place, a rundown cabin deep in the woods, a good hour from the nearest town. He wanted me to go with him for the weekend to fix the place up. Said it would be fun like when we were kids. I agreed, not because I wanted to, but because I felt guilty. He had done all of this on his own, and I figured the least I could do was help. The drive was long, the roads winding. As we got closer, the pavement turned to gravel, then to dirt. The forest thickened around us, tall pines stretching high, their shadows long. By the time we reached the cabin, the sun was low, casting everything in an eerie orange glow. The place was worse than I expected. The wood was old and weathered, the roof sagging in places. It smelled like rot. Nate didn't seem to care. He was excited, already talking about what we needed to fix first, about how great it was going to be once we got it in shape. The first night was uneventful. We built a fire in the old wood stove, ate canned food, talked about stupid things. The kind of conversations you have when the world feels far away. But I had this feeling, this nagging discomfort. It wasn't the isolation, that didn't bother me. It was something else, something I couldn't put my finger on. The next morning, we got to work. Nate was chopping wood while I started clearing out the inside. There were old things left behind. Rusted tools, broken furniture, strange carvings in the walls. At first, I thought they were just random marks, maybe from whoever had lived here before. But as I looked closer, they seemed deliberate. Symbols, patterns. Something about them unsettled me. I went outside to tell Nate, but he wasn't there. His axe was stuck in a tree stump, the woodpile half finished. I called his name. Nothing. For a moment, I thought maybe he had gone into the trees to relieve himself. But the longer I stood there, the more wrong it felt. It was too quiet. No birds, no wind, just stillness. Then a sound, a rustling deep in the woods, too heavy for a small animal. I called for him again, louder this time. No response. I walked toward the noise, my heartbeat loud in my ears. The trees seemed to close in around me, the light dimmed despite the clear sky. Then I saw something, a shape, half hidden behind a tree. It wasn't Nate. It was tall, lean, its skin dark and rough like bark. It stood perfectly still, watching. I should have run, but I couldn't move. My body locked up, my mind racing, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Then it tilted its head, slow, deliberate. I turned and ran. I didn't stop until I was back at the cabin. I slammed the door shut, bolted it. My hands were shaking as I grabbed the axe. My breathing was ragged. I kept telling myself I was imagining things, that it was just a trick of the light, that my mind was playing games with me. Then the footsteps started, soft, measured, moving around the cabin. I gripped the axe tighter. I didn't want to look. I didn't want to see. Hours passed, maybe more. The footsteps stopped eventually, but I didn't dare move. I stayed awake, staring at the door, waiting. At some point, exhaustion took over. I don't even remember falling asleep. When I woke, the sun was up, the cabin silent. I opened the door slowly, stepping outside. Nate's axe was still there, the woodpile still half finished. But he was gone. I called for him, searched the trees, followed the path he might have taken. Nothing, just the endless stretch of forest, empty and quiet. I don't remember driving back to town. I don't remember much of anything after that. Just the fear, the way it sat in my chest, heavy, suffocating. The police searched, of course. They found no signs of him, no tracks, no blood, nothing. It was like he had never been there at all. They asked if we had been drinking, if maybe he had wandered off and gotten lost. But I knew better. I knew what I saw. I never went back to that cabin. I never will. Nate is still missing. The rain started halfway through my drive up the mountain. At first, it was light, just enough to make me flick the wipers on every few minutes. But by the time I reached the tree line, it was pouring in thick, slanted sheets. My phone had lost service miles ago, and I hadn't seen another car for at least an hour. The narrow road twisted sharply around the mountainside, forcing me to slow down more than I wanted to. I had booked the cabin months in advance, planning for a quiet weekend away from everything. Work, noise, people. It was listed as secluded, which was exactly what I was looking for. The listing said it had a small generator, a wood stove, and enough firewood for a couple of days. No Wi-Fi, no neighbors, nothing but woods and silence. That was what I wanted. At least that's what I had thought when I booked it. When I finally saw the turnoff, I almost missed it. A barely visible wooden sign, soaked and dark from the rain, pointed down a narrow dirt path. The road leading to the cabin was worse than I expected. Muddy and full of deep ruts from previous travelers. My tires struggled in places, but the car managed. After about half a mile, the cabin came into view through the trees. It looked exactly like the pictures, small, weathered, and simple. The porch sagged slightly in the middle, and the windows were dark. I pulled up as close as I could, parking on a patch of gravel that was rapidly turning into mud. The rain made everything feel heavier, darker. The trees crowded in on the cabin from all sides, their wet branches dripping steadily. The place felt different than it had in the listing's bright photos. The isolation that I had been so eager for now felt more like abandonment. I hurried up the porch steps, fumbling with the lockbox. It took me longer than it should have to get the key out, my fingers stiff from the cold. The door creaked as it swung open, revealing the dim interior. The air smelled like wood and dampness, but it was clean. Simple furniture, a small couch, a table, 2 chairs. A wood stove sat in the corner, next to a pile of neatly stacked logs. The generator was a small one, just enough to power a couple of lights and the mini fridge. I set my bag down and shook the rain off my jacket, closing the door behind me. The silence settled in immediately. Not the peaceful kind, though. It was too still. No wind, no distant cars, no hum of insects, just the soft sound of the rain hitting the roof. I turned on the single overhead light, which flickered weakly before steadying. It wasn't much, but it made the place feel less empty. I lit the wood stove next, adding a couple of logs and watching as the flames took hold. The warmth helped, but that feeling, that strange, pressing stillness, didn't go away. After changing into dry clothes, I made a quick dinner from the supplies I had brought. The wind picked up outside, making the trees sway and groan. I kept glancing at the windows, half expecting to see something moving in the darkness, but there was nothing, just the rain and the trees. I tried to settle in with a book, but I couldn't focus. The quiet felt unnatural, like something was listening. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks. I had wanted isolation. This was what I had signed up for. At some point, I must have dozed off because I woke up to the sound of something moving outside. A single, deliberate step on the porch. My breath caught and I listened, heart hammering. Another step, slow, heavy. I sat up carefully, my pulse roaring in my ears. The fire had burned low, casting flickering shadows across the walls. I reached for my flashlight and aimed it toward the window. The beam cut through the darkness, but I saw nothing, just rain and trees. I told myself it was an animal, a deer maybe, a bear, though I doubted one would come up onto the porch. Still, I stayed awake, listening. The sound didn't come again. The next morning, I stepped onto the porch, scanning the ground. The rain had washed most of it away, but there were footprints in the mud. Not animal prints, boots, leading up to the porch and then back into the trees. I didn't stay long after that. I packed my things, threw them in the car, and left. The feeling of being watched never faded until I was back on the main road, heading down the mountain. I never reported it. What would I say? That someone walked up to the cabin in the middle of the night and left without a trace? That wasn't a crime, but it was enough to make sure I never went back. I had never been the kind of person to believe in bad omens, but if I had known what was coming, I might have turned the car around the moment I saw the old, abandoned gas station on the side of the road. It stood there, half collapsed, the faded paint of its sign barely visible through the rust and peeling wood. The windows were broken out, and the inside was nothing but darkness, swallowing up the last of the evening light. Something about it put a knot in my stomach, but I ignored it. I had driven too far to turn back now. The cabin was deep in the woods, far from any main roads. I had rented it online, looking for some peace and quiet away from the city. The listing promised seclusion, a true off-the-grid experience. It had no Wi-Fi, no cell service, and only a small generator for power. That was exactly what I needed, a break from everything. By the time I arrived, the sun had set completely, and the forest around me was pitch black. The headlights of my car barely cut through the trees, revealing a narrow dirt path leading up to the cabin. The air was cold, even for late autumn, and the silence was so thick it pressed against my ears. No wind, no animals, just silence. I parked the car and grabbed my bag, my footsteps crunching against the gravel. The cabin was small, a simple wooden structure with a steeply sloped roof. The windows were dark, reflecting the dim glow of my headlights back at me like empty eyes. I took a deep breath, shaking off the uneasy feeling creeping up my spine, and unlocked the door. Inside, it was just as rustic as I had expected. A single room with a fireplace, a wooden table with 2 chairs, and a narrow cot pushed against the far wall. The air smelled like dust and old wood. I flipped the light switch, nothing. Right, the generator. I stepped back outside, walking around to the small shed where it was stored. I had watched a video on how to start it before I left, and after a few pulls of the cord, it roared to life, sending a deep hum through the night. The lights flickered on inside the cabin, casting long shadows across the walls. I locked the door behind me and set my bag down. Everything was fine. Just me, the woods, and a few days of solitude. But that first night, I didn't sleep well. The silence outside wasn't peaceful, it was oppressive. I kept waking up, expecting to hear something. A branch snapping, an animal rustling in the leaves. But there was nothing. Only the occasional groan of the cabin settling, the soft whir of the generator outside. Sometime past midnight, I heard a sound. Not from outside, but from inside the cabin. A soft tap, then another. It was coming from the far wall, near the cot where I lay. I held my breath, listening. The tapping continued, slow and rhythmic. 3 taps, a pause, 3 more, like something was knocking, not hard but deliberately. I sat up, my heart pounding. I grabbed my flashlight and pointed it at the wall. Nothing there. I told myself it was just the cabin shifting, just the wood adjusting to the cold night air. But I didn't sleep after that. The next morning, I stepped outside and looked around. The trees stood tall and unmoving, the ground covered in a thick layer of damp leaves. There were no tracks, no sign of animals, nothing to explain the tapping. I spent most of the day exploring, trying to shake the unease from the night before. I walked down to the small creek behind the cabin, followed it for a while, listening to the gentle rush of water over the rocks. The sun was bright, and for a few hours I felt fine. Even foolish for letting my imagination get the best of me. But that night, the tapping came again. This time it was louder, more insistent. 3 taps, a pause, 3 more. I gripped the flashlight and scanned the room, but again, nothing. I forced myself to lay back down, my heart hammering in my chest. I didn't sleep. By the 3rd night, I was ready to leave. I packed my things and planned to drive out first thing in the morning. I didn't care about the money I had spent. I just wanted to be somewhere else. But that night, something changed. The tapping didn't come from the wall. It came from the door. 3 slow, deliberate knocks. I froze, gripping the blanket tight in my fists. My mind raced, trying to come up with an explanation. The wind? No, there was no wind. An animal? No animal would knock like that. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. Then the doorknob turned. The lock held, but something was outside. I grabbed my keys and my bag, my hands shaking as I crept toward the door. I had to get out. I had to get to my car. But as I reached for the handle, the knocking came again. Louder this time, more urgent. I ran. I threw open the door and sprinted for my car, not looking back. The trees seemed to close in around me, the night swallowing me whole. I fumbled with the keys, yanking open the door and throwing myself inside. I locked it, my breath coming in ragged gasps. For a long moment, I sat there, staring at the cabin. The door was still closed. Nothing moved. The forest was still silent. Then my headlights flickered. The generator was still running, but my car's headlights dimmed for just a second, like something had passed in front of them. I didn't wait. I started the engine and peeled out of there, the tires kicking up gravel as I sped down the narrow dirt road. I didn't stop driving until I reached the main road, until I saw streetlights and houses, until I knew I was safe. I never found out what was at that cabin, never went back, but I know one thing for sure. Something was out there, and it knew I was there too. I remember the first time I stepped foot in that cabin. It wasn't anything special. A 1-story structure with a slanted metal roof, tucked away deep in the woods. My uncle had bought it a few years back, mostly as a hunting retreat, but after he passed, the place sat empty. My father figured it was a waste, so he suggested I take a weekend and check it out. The drive there was long, the roads turning from asphalt to gravel, then to dirt. The closer I got, the fewer houses I saw. Eventually, there was nothing but trees. I had to check my phone several times to make sure I was even going the right way, but service was spotty. By the time I pulled up to the clearing where the cabin stood, I felt completely isolated. The place was old, but sturdy. My uncle had kept it in good condition. At least, that's what I told myself as I stood outside, staring at the warped wooden steps leading up to the porch. The front door was locked, but the key was right where my dad said it would be, under a loose brick near the foundation. Inside, the air was stale. Dust coated the furniture, and the scent of old wood and mildew filled my nose. There were a few essentials: an old couch, a small dining table, and a wood-burning stove. My uncle had left behind a few supplies in the kitchen, but most of it was canned food, probably well past its expiration date. The water still worked, though it came out of the tap with a rusty tint at first. I spent the first hour unpacking, setting up my sleeping bag on the couch since the bedroom looked even dustier than the rest of the cabin. I found an old lantern and a few half-burnt candles in a drawer, which I figured would come in handy since the power was unreliable out here. I wasn't planning to stay up late anyway. As the sun started to set, the woods around me grew quiet. I hadn't noticed it at first, but the usual sounds of birds and insects had faded. It wasn't eerie, not yet, just different. I stepped outside onto the porch and took a deep breath, enjoying the crisp air. That's when I noticed something strange. About 30 feet from the cabin, Just beyond the clearing, the grass looked disturbed. The dirt was uneven, like something had been digging. At first, I thought maybe an animal had been rooting around, but the more I looked, the stranger it seemed. The pattern wasn't random. It was almost as if something or someone had been digging deliberately in neat, shallow rows. I shook it off, convincing myself it was nothing, and went back inside. Night fell fast in the woods. I lit one of the candles and settled in, flipping through an old book my uncle had left behind. But the uneasy feeling wouldn't leave me. The silence outside was thick, pressing in against the cabin. Then I heard it, a rustling sound. Not the wind, not a small animal. Something bigger. Slow, deliberate footsteps crunching on dried leaves. I held my breath and listened. It stopped. I told myself it was a deer, maybe a raccoon. But deep down, I wasn't so sure. For the next hour, I stayed still, straining to hear anything else. Nothing. I finally convinced myself to sleep, though it took longer than I wanted to admit. Around 2 a.m., I woke up suddenly, my skin cold and my heart racing. Something wasn't right. I didn't know why, but I could feel it. I sat up, my ears searching for any sound. Then it came again. The footsteps, closer this time. I reached for my flashlight, but before I could turn it on, something scratched against the cabin wall. A slow, dragging scrape just beneath the window. My breath caught in my throat. I waited, frozen. Then silence. Minutes passed, maybe an hour. I couldn't move. I sat there in the dark, listening to my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. Eventually, exhaustion won. I must have dozed off because the next thing I knew, the sun was filtering through the trees. I didn't waste time. I packed my bag, grabbed my keys, and walked outside. But when I reached the clearing, I stopped cold. More disturbed earth. This time, it was closer to the cabin. The same neat, shallow rows of dug-up dirt. And there, in the center of it all, were footprints. Human footprints. Bare, deep imprints in the soil, leading toward the trees. I didn't look back. I got in my truck, turned the key, and drove. I didn't stop until I reached the main road. I never told my dad what I saw. I never went back to that cabin. And I still don't know who or what was out there that night. But I know one thing. I wasn't alone. I had been looking forward to the weekend at the cabin for weeks. A long break from work, some quiet time away from the city, and the chance to finally unwind in the woods. I had rented a small, isolated cabin deep in the mountains, hours away from the nearest town. The listing described it as rustic but comfortable, with no Wi-Fi and only a weak cell signal. Exactly what I needed. The drive up was uneventful at first. The last hour took me onto a winding dirt road, flanked by dense trees on either side. Felt like I was leaving the world behind. The deeper I went, the more I noticed how still everything was. No cars, no people. Even the birds seemed quieter. When I finally pulled up to the cabin, the sun was beginning to dip below the trees, casting long shadows. The place was small but solid. Wooden walls, a sloped metal roof, and a porch that looked out over the trees. Inside, it smelled of old wood and dust. There was a single bedroom, a kitchen with outdated appliances, and a tiny living room with a wood-burning stove. The electricity worked, but the cabin ran mostly on propane. A few dim bulbs flickered to life as I tested the switches. I unpacked, made a quick dinner, and settled in for the night. The quiet was almost overwhelming. I hadn't realized how much constant noise I was used to until it was gone. No humming appliances, no distant traffic, just the wind in the trees. That first night, I woke up around 3 a.m. At first, I wasn't sure what had pulled me from sleep. Then I heard it, a faint rustling outside. Probably an animal, I told myself. Still, I got up and looked out the window. The trees swayed gently, but I didn't see anything unusual, just darkness and shadows. I went back to bed, but sleep didn't come easily. The next day, I went on a long hike, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling from the night before. I followed a trail that wound through the forest, occasionally breaking into clearings with stunning views of the valley below. I saw no one else the entire time. By the time I got back to the cabin, the sun was already low in the sky. That night, I made a fire in the wood stove and read by its light. The cabin felt cozier, but that feeling of unease never fully went away. As I was getting ready for bed, I heard something again. This time, it wasn't just rustling, it was a clear, deliberate sound. Footsteps on the porch. I froze. My first thought was that maybe it was a bear, but bears don't usually walk so steadily. I turned off the light, my heart pounding, and moved slowly toward the window. The porch was empty. I waited, barely breathing. After a few minutes, I heard it again, but this time from the side of the cabin. Someone or something was moving around out there. My rental agreement had mentioned a hunting rifle in a locked case above the fireplace. I had dismissed it at first, but now I felt an urgent need for it. I grabbed the flashlight and shined it outside, sweeping the beam across the trees. Nothing, but as I turned away, I caught something out of the corner of my eye, a shape just beyond the reach of the light, disappearing into the trees. I locked the door and sat on the couch, gripping the flashlight, listening. I didn't sleep much that night. The next morning, I walked around the cabin, looking for tracks. In the damp earth near the porch steps, I found them. Footprints, human ones. They led from the tree line to my porch, then around the cabin, then back into the woods. I packed my bags. The rental was for the whole weekend, but I wasn't staying another night. I locked the cabin behind me, threw my things into the car, and sped down that dirt road, glancing in the rearview mirror every few seconds. I didn't stop until I hit the main road, miles away. Only then did I take a deep breath. Later, I looked up the area online. A few missing persons cases, some unsolved break-ins. Nothing major, but I knew what I heard, what I saw. Someone had been out there watching, waiting. I never went back. I don't know why I thought it would be a good idea to go up there alone. Maybe I wanted some time to myself, away from everything, work, traffic, the noise of the city. I rented the cabin for a week, thinking the quiet would do me some good. The drive was long, about 6 hours north of home, deep into the mountains. The last stretch of road wasn't really a road at all, just dirt and gravel winding through thick trees. No cell service, no signs, just trees pressing in from both sides, blocking out most of the late afternoon light. The cabin was small, old, but sturdy. One floor, a porch, a single chimney. The listing said it had power but no Wi-Fi, which I was fine with. It sat by itself in a clearing, surrounded by trees, the nearest town nearly an hour away. The air smelled like pine, the ground covered in dried needles that crunched under my boots as I carried my bags inside. Inside was simple, wood walls, wood floors, a stone fireplace, a small kitchen with a gas stove and an old fridge that made a constant buzzing sound. There was a bedroom with a single bed, a bathroom that smelled faintly of mildew, and a back door that led to a narrow trail heading into the woods. The place felt abandoned, like no one had stayed here for a long time. Dust covered the wooden table. The air was stale, but I told myself that was normal. It was an old cabin in the middle of nowhere. What else should I expect? That first night, I unpacked, made myself dinner, and sat on the porch as the sun set behind the trees. The quiet was heavy, pressing. No cars,
No distant voices.
Just wind rustling through the leaves and the occasional crack of a branch deep in the woods. I told myself it was peaceful, but I felt unsettled. Maybe it was just the unfamiliarity, the isolation. I went to bed early, listening to the sounds of the forest outside. I woke up in the middle of the night to a sound, a low, steady knocking. At first, I thought it was coming from the front door, but as I sat up, I realized it was deeper in the house, somewhere near the kitchen. 3 knocks, a pause, then 3 more. I lay there holding my breath. My mind tried to rationalize it. The old fridge, the wind, the house settling. I stayed in bed, listening. Stopped after a while, but it took me a long time to fall back asleep. The next morning, I checked everything. The fridge was still buzzing. The wind was still moving through the trees, but there was nothing that explained the knocking. I told myself I imagined it, just the kind of thing your mind makes up when you're alone in an unfamiliar place. I went on a hike, following the narrow path behind the cabin, trying to push the unease out of my head. The trail led uphill for a while before leveling out. The trees were thick, the ground soft with layers of pine needles. It was beautiful, but I felt watched the entire time. Every so often, I'd stop, turning to look behind me, but there was nothing, just trees, silence. That feeling of being observed sat heavy in my gut, but I pushed on. I came across an old wooden structure, just a few logs stacked together, half collapsed. Maybe an old hunter's blind? I didn't get too close, just made a note of it before turning back. That night, I locked the doors, double-checked the windows, and left a light on in the kitchen. I lay in bed, listening. Nothing, just wind and the creaks of an old house. But then, right around midnight, the knocking started again. 3 knocks, a pause, 3 more. It sounded closer this time, not from the kitchen, but from the other side of the bedroom wall. I sat up, heart pounding. The wall backed up to the outside. I tried to tell myself it was a branch hitting the wood, maybe a raccoon or something. I didn't move. I just sat there, barely breathing. The knock stopped, and I waited, but nothing else happened. The next morning, I went outside and checked the wall where I heard the knocking. The wood was smooth, no branches nearby.
No marks.
Nothing that could explain the sound. That uneasy feeling was stronger now, like something was pressing against me, something unseen but close. That day, I drove into town, needing to be around people, needing to feel normal again. It was a small town, just a general store, a gas station, a diner. I bought supplies, sat in the diner for a while, drinking coffee, listening to the quiet conversations around me. It helped for a little bit. But then the waitress, an older woman with deep lines on her face, asked me where I was staying. When I told her about the cabin, her expression changed. Not shock, not concern, just something unreadable, like she knew something I didn't. Not many people go up there, she said. I asked why, but she just shrugged and walked away. That night, I kept the lights on. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, waiting. Midnight came. The knocking started. 3 knocks. A pause. 3 more. I couldn't take it anymore. I jumped out of bed, grabbed the flashlight, and stormed outside, shining the beam along the walls into the trees. Nothing, just darkness and the sound of my own breathing. I stood there for a long time listening, and then, in the distance, I heard something. Not knocking, not an animal. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, moving away from the cabin. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the chair by the fireplace, waiting for the sun. The second it was light enough, I packed my things, threw them into the car, and left. I didn't look back. I don't know who or what was out there. Maybe it was some local messing with me. Maybe it was just my own paranoia. But I know what I heard, and I know I'm never going back.